The wind carried dust like whispers across the barren street of a town long forgotten. The boards of the saloon creaked when no one touched them, the church bell hung crooked, and tumbleweeds rolled as if they were the last living things that remembered the place. All it'd take to scare off the snakes that nested in the broken foundations. But to a solitary rancher with little more than his donkey, a battered hat, and the weight of years heavy on his shoulders, it was worth exactly $2. $2, a handshake, and a strange sense that maybe the ghosts themselves had been waiting for someone foolish enough, or brave enough, to care. The rancher hadn't planned on buying it. He'd gone to the county auction for a saddle, maybe a new plow if luck was kind. Instead, a yellowing deed to a parcel of land, known locally as Hollow Creek Ghost Town, was passed across the table, unwanted, unsold. The auctioneer grunted, $2 and she's yours. A chuckle ran through the room. Folks always laughed at the rancher, a man with no kin, talking more to his donkey than to other men. But he slapped 2 silver coins on the desk without a word, tucked the deed into his coat, and led his donkey back into the sun. To him, it wasn't a punchline. It was a place to belong. The first nights in Hollow Creek were colder than any prairie he'd slept under. The rancher pitched camp in the old sheriff's office, his donkey tethered out front as though waiting for lawmen who would never come. The buildings groaned at night, wind shrieked through bullet holes in forgotten walls, and sometimes he swore he heard footsteps where there should have been none. He'd sit with his back against the wall, hand resting on his old revolver, whispering to his donkey, "Ain't no one here but us, boy. Just us and the dust." Still, the town felt alive, as though it resented being abandoned, as though it demanded to be remembered. Every morning, the rancher worked like Hollow Creek might stand again. He patched roofs with tin, hammered loose boards, cleared out glass that crunched like bones underfoot. He shoveled dirt from the church steps until the bell rang clear in the wind again. All the while, his donkey followed faithfully, sometimes stubborn, sometimes playful, nosing through ruins as though hunting for secrets. Folks who passed by the old trail would shake their heads, that fool's fixing ghosts for company. But the rancher didn't care. It gave him purpose, and in the quiet moments, he started to feel less alone. It happened on a blistering afternoon. The donkey, nosing around behind the old hotel, began braying, stomping at the earth. The rancher thought it was snakes again, but when he came running, he saw the donkey hooves had struck against something metallic buried in the ground. He knelt, brushed away dirt, and froze. The sun glinted on edges that weren't rock, weren't rust, but gold, thick, heavy bars stamped with markings older than any memory in town. His breath caught in his throat. He dug deeper, uncovering a chest, then another. The donkey brayed louder, pawing like he'd won a prize fight against the ghosts themselves. The rancher's hands shook as he pried open the first chest. Gold, raw and real, stacked like sunlight trapped in metal, nearly blinding. He staggered back, hat falling into the dust, his donkey staring at him as though asking if it meant more hay in the future. It wasn't just gold, it was history, the lost fortune of Hollow Creek. Word had it the mine owner fled during a war, burying wealth in fear of raids, never to return. Generations forgot, but the donkey remembered with his hooves, and now it sat glittering under the rancher's gaze, not $2 worth of dust, but 200 million in forgotten treasure. At first, the rancher laughed, a deep, broken laugh that shook the quiet street. He laughed until it turned into sobs, until the weight of it pressed on him heavier than poverty ever had. What did a lonely man with a donkey do with riches that could rebuild empires? He sat in the dirt, hands dirty with gold dust, and whispered to his donkey, "Guess you're the richest soul in Hollow Creek now." But he knew the world outside wouldn't leave this secret untouched for long. Money had a smell, and men had a way of following it. Word spread quicker than wildfire. First came drifters, poking around ruins with greedy eyes. Then came men in suits, papers in hand claiming ownership of deeds long expired. Then came guns, holstered low, carried by men who smelled blood and fortune both. Hollow Creek, once forgotten, now throbbed with the footsteps of the living, each set heavier with greed. The rancher stood at his doorway with a shotgun, donkey at his side, and said the only words he'd spoken to strangers in years, "This here's mine." Bought it fair. They laughed, but none dared step closer. Ghost towns had rules, and this one had a guardian. Nights grew longer, darker. The rancher lit lamps in every window, not to welcome, but to warn. He felt eyes watching from the hills, felt the weight of fortune pressing on him until he feared it might crush him. And yet, every morning, He saddled his donkey, patched more boards, and worked as though Hollow Creek was breathing again. He whispered to the town, "Don't worry. Ain't no one running you down again." The gold was wealth, but the town was his salvation. And if men thought they could take it, they'd learn the rancher wasn't just a lonely fool with a donkey. He was Hollow Creek itself now. The donkey brayed at dawn, ears flicking toward the hills. The rancher followed its gaze, and sure enough, riders were coming. Not drifters, not curious men, organized, dangerous, the kind who wouldn't stop at talk. He loaded his rifle slow, eyes hard, and touched the donkey neck. "Reckon they don't know what it means to pay $2 for a place. Reckon we'll teach 'em." And for the first time in decades, Hollow Creek was no longer silent. It was ready for war, gold gleaming like fire under its soil, ghost stirring with pride. The riders reached the edge of Hollow Creek as the sun dipped low, silhouettes sharp against the dying light. Their horses snorted, restless, and their rifles glinted like fangs in the dusk. The rancher stood at the end of the street, dust curling around his boots, his donkey steady beside him, ears twitching but unafraid. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a man in a black coat urged his horse forward, a smile carved deep into his weathered face. $200 million don't belong to a ghost town, old man, he drawled. It belongs to men who can use it. The rancher spat into the dust, his silence louder than words. Hollow Creek creaked as though listening, siding with the man who had patched its wounds. The standoff held until the black-coated man leaned forward, his smile souring. "You think you can stop us? You and that mule." The donkey brayed loud and long, stamping its hoofs so hard that dust billowed around it like smoke. The men chuckled at first, but their laughter faltered when the rancher raised his shotgun, steady as stone, the barrels glinting in the twilight. "This land was dead before I came," he said in a voice rough as gravel. "Now it's alive again. That gold ain't yours, it's the town's, and I reckon the town chose me." His words rolled through the empty buildings, and for the first time, the riders seemed to hear the weight of silence answering back. When the first shot rang out, it wasn't his. A gunman in the back fired too soon, nervous, and the bullet shattered a sign above the saloon. Wood splintered, echoes cracking like thunder through the ghost town. The rancher didn't flinch. He fired once, and the gunman toppled from his saddle. Chaos erupted, horses rearing, men cursing, smoke curling thick in the fading light. The donkey bolted for cover but didn't run far, circling back toward its master with an instinct that seemed almost human. The rancher fired again, his years of hunting and solitude turning every shot into something deadly. Hollow Creek came alive with gunfire, but it was the rancher who stood at its heart, immovable. By nightfall, the street was littered with blood and fear. The riders who survived dragged their wounded away, their bravado broken, their hunger for gold dimmed by the man who had defended ghosts with nothing but grit. The black-coated leader lingered, eyes burning with hatred, before retreating with a promise. "This ain't over. You're one man. You can't fight forever." The rancher lowered his shotgun, chest heaving, and whispered more to himself than to anyone else, "Forever's a long time. But this town's got me." The donkey ambled back, pressing its nose against his arm as though to remind him he wasn't as alone as he thought. In the days that followed, Hollow Creek grew different. Travelers came not for gold, but to see the fool who had bought a ghost town and defended it against men who thought themselves wolves. Some offered supplies, some swung hammers to help mend the broken church, some left coins at the saloon bar as though paying respects to spirits. The rancher accepted their help sparingly, never asking, but the town began to breathe with life again. And yet, beneath every moment of rebuilding, the treasure still slept under the soil, a promise and a curse waiting to stir more greed. The donkey, restless, unearthed more chests as days went by, each discovery both a blessing and a burden. The rancher buried them deeper, marking no map, telling no one. Gold was no good for the living if it only drew death closer. He fed his donkey an apple one evening and muttered, "You're the only one fool enough to dig up fortune and not care what it means." The donkey brayed softly, content with hay and water, never craving more. The rancher thought then that maybe his companion was wiser than any man who'd ever lived. But men have a way of sniffing out secrets. By winter, rumors had reached the cities. Hollow Creek became a name whispered in saloons and plotted over in back rooms. Not just outlaws, but bankers, speculators, and politicians began to circle like vultures. Letters arrived demanding sale. Men in fine boots rode up with offers wrapped in velvet threats. The rancher, standing in the same dust that had first greeted him, shook his head each time. This place ain't for sale. They left angry, but anger carried weight, and he could feel the storm building again. One night, he woke to fire. Flames licked the side of the church, smoke curling thick through the sky. He and the donkey rushed with buckets, choking on ash as they doused what they could. The attackers had vanished by the time he raised his shotgun, but their message was clear: they would burn Hollow Creek to the ground rather than let one man guard its treasure. Standing in the glow of dying embers, the rancher swore aloud to the town itself, "They'll have to take me with it, if they want it gone." His donkey pressed against him, steady as the earth, its eyes reflecting the flames. Winter bled into spring, and the rancher worked harder than ever. He dug trenches, fortified walls, turned ruins into strongholds. The donkey carried water, hauled stone, brayed at every shadow as though warning the rancher of threats before they came. Together, they transformed Hollow Creek not into the bustling town it once was, but into a fortress of memory, defended by love as much as by guns. And with each passing day, the rancher realized something: the gold mattered less than the town itself. The ghosts he had once imagined weren't angry anymore. They were grateful. The rancher sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in blood and fire. He reached down, scratching behind the donkey ears, his voice soft. "We ain't rich, not the way they think. Rich is having something to fight for. Rich is not being alone." The donkey leaned into his hand, content. In that moment, with the town behind him and the world ahead, the rancher finally understood why fate had led him to buy Hollow Creek for $2. He hadn't purchased land, he had purchased belonging, and no amount of gold, no number of enemies, could take that away. The spring thaw brought more than green shoots through the cracked soil of Hollow Creek, it brought men in numbers the rancher had prayed would never come. Not just outlaws with patched saddles, but wagons laden with supplies, rifles stacked in crates, and men whose clothes spoke of money and power. They didn't ride like raiders, they marched like an army. Dust rose in clouds from their wheels, settling on the roofs of the town as if trying to bury it before they even fired a shot. From the ridge above, the rancher and his donkey watched, the man with a shotgun laid across his knees, the beast stamping its hoof impatiently. "Looks like we stirred the wrong nest, partner," the rancher muttered. The donkey brayed, as though agreeing, or daring him to stand taller. By nightfall, the invaders had set camp on the outskirts, fires burning bright enough to blind the stars. Their voices carried across the valley, laughter laced with cruelty, plans spoken aloud like Hollow Creek was already theirs. The rancher sat silent on the porch of the saloon, lantern unlit, listening. His donkey paced the street, ears flicking at every echo. The town felt tense, like a bowstring pulled taut, the ghosts waiting to see if this living man would still claim them when death came knocking. He closed his eyes and whispered, "If this is the end, let it be one worth remembering." At dawn, the first wave came. Not gunfire, but words. A man in a gray suit, polished boots gleaming, strode into Hollow Creek as though it were a parlor. He raised his voice, sharp and practiced. $200 million sit beneath this soil. We can give you a place in history, old man. Name your price. The rancher didn't move, his donkey standing squarely in the street like a sentinel. Silence stretched, broken only when the donkey brayed so loud it startled the man in gray. The rancher finally spoke, voice low and steady. "This town ain't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." The man sneered, turned back, and the order was given. Men raised rifles. Hollow Creek breathed in deep. The gunfire came like a storm. Bullets tore through wood, shattering glass, splintering the bones of buildings already fragile. The rancher fired back, methodical, unshaken, every pull of the trigger a promise. His donkey darted beside him, not fleeing, but weaving between cover, braying at attackers like a creature possessed. At one point it lunged at a man who'd broken the line, teeth sinking into his arm, sending him sprawling. The fight raged for hours, smoke thick, air burning with gunpowder. Yet the rancher stood unbroken, his donkey beside him, two unlikely defenders holding an entire army at bay. By evening, bodies lay scattered at the edge of town, and the invaders pulled back, stunned by resistance fiercer than they'd imagined. But the rancher was bleeding, his shoulder grazed, his breath ragged. He leaned against the saloon post, shotgun hanging loose, while his donkey pressed close, nudging his side as though to keep him upright. He chuckled through the pain. "You're a good soldier, old friend. Better than most men I've known." The donkey nuzzled him once, then wandered toward the rubble near the church, digging at the earth with frantic hooves. The rancher frowned, too weary to stop him. Minutes later, dirt gave way, revealing not another chest of gold, but something stranger, documents sealed in oilskin, untouched by time. Shaking, the rancher unwrapped the brittle papers. They weren't maps to treasure. They were deeds, land claims, proof that Hollow Creek itself had been stolen generations ago, its gold ripped from the hands of its rightful people. Names, signatures, betrayals inked in black and red. The fortune buried beneath the soil wasn't just wealth, it was history, blood, and justice denied. The rancher's heart hammered as realization struck. This was bigger than him, bigger than outlaws, bigger even than the men in gray. Hollow Creek didn't need a guardian of treasure. It needed a keeper of truth. The news spread fast. When the invaders returned for another push, they didn't find a broken rancher begging for mercy. They found him standing in the street, holding the documents high, his voice thundering. This gold ain't mine, and it ain't yours. It belongs to the ones it was stolen from. And by God, I'll die before I let another thief take it. His words rippled through the men like fire, some faltering, some lowering rifles, unease cutting through their greed. For the first time, the rancher saw cracks, not in Hollow Creek, but in his enemies. Truth had weight, heavier than any bullet. The standoff stretched, but fate chose its side. Riders appeared on the horizon, not bandits, but descendants of those whose names were written in the deeds. Word had reached them, carried by whispers faster than gunfire. They came not with violence, but with dignity, their presence undeniable. Faced with the rancher's defiance and the rightful heirs' arrival, the invaders broke. One by one, wagons turned, rifles lowered, greed retreating under the weight of justice. Hollow Creek stood battered but unbowed, its future suddenly more than ruins and shadows. That night, under a sky washed clean by stars, the rancher sat by a fire with the new arrivals. They spoke of rebuilding not just buildings, but honor. They thanked him, not for gold, but for courage, for listening when others would have sold silence. His donkey lay beside him, belly full of oats gifted in gratitude, its ears flicking contentedly. The rancher stared into the flames and whispered, "Guess you knew all along, didn't you? You weren't digging for gold. You were digging for the truth." The donkey brayed softly, as though agreeing, and the fire cracked like laughter between old friends. When morning came, Hollow Creek was no longer a ghost town. It was a town of voices, footsteps, plans, and promises. The rancher, still scarred, still weary, stood taller than he ever had. He hadn't just bought a ghost town for $2. He had bought redemption, for the land, for its people, and maybe even for himself. And as the sun rose high, casting long shadows that looked more like guardians than ghosts, he scratched the donkey neck and said, "We did it, partner. $2 well spent." The donkey brayed once, loud enough to echo off every building, sealing Hollow Creek's rebirth with the sound of a town alive again.